Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Pride Cymru panel. This time, this is a co-production with Glitter Cymru, and we would like to thank the Heritage Lottery Fund for supporting this event. Today's topic has been highly requested over the past year, and the title is, Where Are We? Finding marginalized communities in the LGBTQ history. As you can see, we have a fantastic panel lined up for you today. I will let them introduce themselves and we will swiftly jump into the questions. That's why you're here for the answers. Sheldon, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm Sheldon Mills. I am a Welsh, gay, black man, cisgendered man, and I was born in Ely in Cardiff. And I now live in London. In my day job, I'm the executive director at the Financial Conduct Authority. And then I volunteer at Stonewall. I'm the chair of trustees at Stonewall, which is the LGBTQ plus charity here in the United Kingdom.
Fantastic. Welcome, Sheldon. Daryl, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Daryl Leeworthy. I'm a historian based at Swansea University and the author of this particular book, which is my only prop of the day. My interests here are pretty much those sorts of professional historical backgrounds, although I do fit very much into the community, and I'm really here to learn from everybody else's experience.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. Naz?
Hi, so my name's Nazmia Jamal. I'm a recent returnee to Cardiff, well, to Wales. I grew up in the Valleys, but I've been in London for a long time, where I worked at the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival for a while. And I suppose in like my biggest kind of passion and hobby is what I think of as feral curating and feral kind of archiving. So I just collect things to do with the 80s and 90s and kind of feminist and particularly Black lesbian women of colour stuff. So yeah, here.
Amazing. Isaac?
My name is Isaac Blake. I am the charity director for the Romani Cultural Arts Company, which is a Gypsy, Roma and Traveller charity. And we're pleased to say we've been celebrating, this is our 12th year trading as a charity, and we've done local and national and international LGBT traveller work. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. And my name is Rania. I am a doctoral researcher at Cardiff University, and I am the co-chair of Glitter Cymru. Fantastic. So we all kind of know a little bit about each other. We have kind of been in other panels or discussions all together. And one thing that has been kind of popping into my head as I've been like meeting you in various meetings is, why are you interested in retrieving the history of marginalized communities? And I think I would like to start with Naz.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. So I've got some props. So this will be an illustrated talk on my side. I suppose the thing that I find really interesting and important about marginalized histories is you know, I'm a queer Muslim woman who grew up in the valleys. Like I kind of live on the margins and actually quite enjoy it there most of the time. So I suppose I wouldn't be who I was if it hadn't been for some of those kind of moments of retrieval. So like the first thing would be, you know, would I be who I am? Would I be speaking here today if whoever it was at Aberdare Library hadn't put this Shiva Press book by Suniti Namjoshi in the library? Because I certainly wasn't going around looking for lesbian books, but I was looking for anything that was written by Indian women at the time. This book changed my life. And I suppose the other kind of thing is about when you're invisible, when those kind of bubbles of hidden history kind of burst into the mainstream. They stay with you forever. So the other kind of bit of, I feel like I'm sort of strange analog slideshow, next slide, is you know, this magazine cover, which is, Sheldon's nodding, this magazine cover from 2002 with Palomi and Paminda on it absolutely changed my life. It made it, because I was queer by then, but I didn't feel like I was part of a community, and I was organising in feminist punk spaces, but everybody was, you know, most people were white. So for me, those moments are really precious, and I know that, you know, I know what they did for me, and I know what, say, me being on this panel or someone seeing that magazine will do for them. The second part of my answer, and I was thinking about this in two ways. There's obviously the personal. I think the other reason why those histories are really important is because there's lots of lessons there about resistance and organising that I think we really need to learn. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting during these last few months has been seeing the Kill the Bill coalition kind of looking back. So in their organising against the police crime sentencing and courts bill, which will affect all of us differently, and some of us more than others, a lot of those organisers are looking back at the poll tax riots, they're looking back at the Criminal Justice Act and thinking about how we organise. And those histories are hidden, those strategies are hidden. They're really useful. They're hidden for a reason so that we can't use them. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nazmia. Anyone else who would like to answer the question?
Next. Thank you. Well, the histories of marginalised communities often tell us more and more truthfully about the histories of the majority of communities than the official history of the latter will ever do, particularly around the notions of identity, sexuality, boundaries, inclusion and exclusion, social order and transgressions. The history of marginalised communities should also be sought out for its own sake in the intersections of majority of history, as the experience, knowledge and wisdom gathered by these communities can be shared equally, if not more profoundly, as a result of the outsider status looking inside. Finally, as marginalised communities are ultimately individual human beings, all human beings experience joy, pain, celebration, suffering, redemption and renewal are valuable, and adding the overall human story to the diversity of society. So that's why I'm here today.
Fantastic. Daryl?
Yeah, for me, it's very similar to Isaac's experience there. So I grew up in the same valley as Naz, ironically, but at the southern end of it. My experience was very much around, if we are a community and we tell ourselves certain things about who we are as a community, what happens when you then, in a very professional sense, in many ways, shine a mirror up to that community and say, well, actually, do those values chime? Are we as tolerant and accepting and embracing and inclusive as we tell ourselves we are, both in terms of our relationship with everybody else, but also then our relationship with the outside world? So the places that are not the valleys, the places that are not South Wales, the places that are not Wales as a whole. And that's really why I've been very interested in marginalisation and thinking about the relationship, therefore, between those who are defined as marginalised, because it is often an outside definition, from somebody else in relation to the bigger story that we tell ourselves about Wales, about Britain, about the valleys, about South Wales, and all of those sorts of things put together.
Really good points, really good points. Sheldon?
Yeah, I thought I didn't have a prop, but I'm at work and I meant to put on a t-shirt, which I was going to wear. But I think it probably explains straight away. So I hope you can see it. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So when I wear this t-shirt, which is usually at UK Black Pride or something, or sometimes I just go to the shops in it, I feel as if I am sending a message to every single person who sees me. And that message is not a present message. It's both present and historical. It asks people to ask a question of themselves. Do you agree with the statement, black is beautiful? And once you ask that question, you know, I ask that question of myself as a black man. And actually, once you inquire into that question, you actually have to think about the stories of people who share my color and my race, because it's intertwined. You cannot just say black is beautiful without history of image, media, slavery, beauty, wonder. You just can't. And I think the way into that for me is that history, that history of both marginalized but quite powerful communities is absolutely important. So when I wear that t-shirt, it's almost like putting on a painful superhero piece of like armor. I'm both in pain because there's many times in my life when I feel that black is not beautiful. I'm both empowered because I know that it is beautiful, and it opens a conversation, even in a glance. And I think these conversations around our history and collecting our history and trying to find it are so meaningful for marginalized communities, because we have been erased, our histories have been erased, our person has been erased, and to go to that prop, our beauty, our wondrous beauty has been attempted to be erased. So that's probably why I'll probably enjoy this conversation.
Wow. So many amazing points, and we're just on question one. This is one of my favorite panel. I'm going to address the next question to Daryl and Isaac. And the question is, gay men are often the most visible part of our community. Where have you found evidence of men having sex with men in Cardiff, in Black and other marginalized communities in the past?
I don't mind going first again.
You can go first, Isaac, yeah.
It's the Leo in me. My star sign is a Leo, so sometimes I gotta remember to calm that Leo energy down. So for us, my vision is, the assumption here is open to question. Is it the case that gay men are often the most visible part of the LGBT plus community? I would disagree with that assumption, and I would suggest that throughout history, for every Achilles, there is the opposite. There is, in literature, in art, in drama, television, film, and myths are filled with highly visible lesbians. For example, lesbians in Lesbos. Visibility of gay men is superficially a consequences of being men, not being gay, and as men, as part of the greater visibility of men in general in the structural and institutional evidence. For example, sex between men. You know, you find evidence in police arrest sheets prior to the decriminalization of homosexuality, court records, prison records, legislation, and religion. So that's, and it's also worth saying that the community that I am from, the Romani and traveller community, are the most disadvantaged and least engaged with minority ethnic groups in the complex ethnic and cultural mosaic of modern European identities, as they occupy a space of intersectionality of race bias, class conflict, ethnic discrimination, cultural appropriation, marginalization, social exclusion that is unique among minority ethnic groups.
Daryl?
That raises a lots of questions for us, doesn't it? It is very much the case that in the historical record, because of the legislative frameworks in which we're operating, then it is men who are the most visible. Women do drop out of that narrative because there was no criminal distinction to be made. And so if we are looking at records which stretch back into the documented 19th century and early 20th century, then that's where we find those men who were arrested and sent to prison, deported, or any of the other questions that we're all facing even in our own times about as a result of having unfortunately been arrested once, been caught once. And that's literally all it is. So, for example, some of the folks who I discovered in the court records from a century ago, from the early 20th century, and included in the book, actually that crime record is the least interesting thing about them. It's all of the other things that are interesting about them. Their photograph, for example, which I then subsequently found, what ships they happened to have served on, where they came from, what their religious observance was, what experiences, therefore, they might have had in a kind of guesswork frame of mind in other port cities. So if you came from the Arabian Peninsula, came to Cardiff, happened to get arrested once for a particular crime in the UK, but then went to America, to South America, to Australia, to other parts of Africa, Asia, India, and so on, what were your experiences there? And that's the thing that we don't have. We just have this one particular criminal record in Cardiff, or in Barry, or in Penarth, Newport, or Swansea, and that's what pings a particular person up. And I think that's then leads us back into what Isaac was saying about representation and why
Absolutely.
we think about these things.
Even just one record is enough to paint the whole picture, isn't it? We've heard a lot about gay men. Can we move on to lesbians and bisexual women now, Naz?
Always. And I do feel obliged to point out at this point that I am actually a double Aries with Scorpio rising, and therefore I am sorry. But
you have a lot of apologizing to do for that combination, 100%.
Kind of sorry, not sorry about that. The gay content you came for. So
you want some astrology to it.
But yeah.
So, Naz, for you, how difficult it has been to find evidence of lesbians and bisexual women in the existing archives, because as Daryl and Isaac pointed out, is a lot more visible for gay men.
So, like, my interest has specifically been around Black and Asian queer women, however they identify, and ideally kind of like the people who sit within the kind of radical political spectrum. Like those are my people, and they're the people that I have like been casting around for, you know, when you kind of look for a mother, you're like, oh, there's Pratibha Palmer, and there's Angela Davis, and there's whatever, and like you find them, but they're really difficult to find because, first of all, I'm not an academic and I'm not a historian. Like, I'm a school teacher who has a kind of all-encompassing set of gay hobbies, and so I don't have institutional access. And when you do get into the institutions, things aren't tagged in the level of detail that you would want them to be. So you don't know if the file on lesbian women has got any Black women in it, for example, and particularly with colonized people who've taken on or have been forced to take on Western names. You just don't know if you're looking at names or even at photos sometimes. So I know that like academics like Caroline Bressie, I believe, has like gone back into the archives and looked at pictures and has had to do this kind of painstaking work trying to figure out from photos what kind of marginalized group these pictures are representing. So kind of the cataloging's a problem. If a white person's cataloging, are they going to care? Are they going to nuance? If a straight person's cataloging, are they going to care? Are they going to nuance? Are the things going to be kept? So along the way, there's been a lot of like hearsay and rumor that I've kind of like grabbed a thread and pulled. So for example, I mean, I've spent most of my time in London, and an ex-girlfriend at one point mentioned that the archive of the Camden Lesbian Centre and Black Lesbian Group was actually held in Glasgow. And so actually the whole of the lesbian archive that used to live in London is in Glasgow. So then there's also that cost implication and the time implication of like, how do you get to Glasgow to look at your history, to see what's in there? So there are those kinds of stories that that kind of illustrate how difficult it is, or how only certain people who have been positioned in particular places are able to access those stories. So because of a set of factors, like I had a very public-facing gay role at the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, so I met a lot of people who were older than me, who were happy to talk to me. I grew up in a multi-generational household with my great-grandmother. My grandmother's still alive. I spend a lot of time talking to older people about their stories, so I'm interested. I kind of know how to do that. So that means that I've been able to gather some stories. So when Lisa Power suggested that maybe I try and find out some of the history of Black and Asian lesbians in Cardiff, for example, we were like, yeah, we can't find anything. And every time I tried to tweet about it, a load of really well-meaning white academics would start clucking around being like, oh, it'd be really good if you could find some. Sorry, Daryl. Everyone was being really helpful, but also what that does is that the Black people that I tagged wouldn't reply. Because really, if there's no history, then the history that you find has to be found by you for you to begin with. So there are some of those issues. But I did manage to kind of pull a thread, and I spoke to Valerie Mason-John, who edited this book, and I'd spoken to her before. I think this book is a really amazing resource, and it kind of really changed a lot of my thinking. Books from the 90s and the 80s had resource lists in the back, for example. Anyway, so I emailed Valerie while we were having coffee the other day talking about the panel, and she said to talk to Joan Thomas. So looked up Joan Thomas on Facebook. Obviously, Joan Thomas now lives basically where I've just moved from in South London, and Joan Thomas is a woman who was part of the Chinese lesbian group in London. She didn't come out, but she lived in Cardiff, and like told me some spectacular stories. Oh, I'm running out of time, sorry. The last thing that I want to say, sorry, I know I'm going over, I'll be really short on my next answer, but also our archives, whether they're feminist or lesbian or whatever, they're not always valued, or they're not always produced in ways that are sustainable. So kind of the resource that I would have looked at to prepare for this would have been the British Library's digital archive of Spare Rib. I would have gone, at one point they had every issue of Spare Rib was digitized. Unfortunately, it was digitized under European law, under European copyright law, which means that as soon as Brexit happened, that resource had to be removed from online. So it's not there anymore.
Wow, that is
okay,
shocking.
That's me.
That is shocking. I will definitely research into this a bit more, because this will affect my work as an academic. We heard a little bit, you mentioned, Naz, role models and people who have been helping you. So I'm going to move to Sheldon now. When you were growing up as a gay teen in Butetown, did you have an idea of any gay role models in Cardiff or anywhere in Wales? And has this fed into your support for the role model work within Stonewall?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I grew up in Ely, not in Butetown, but many friends and relatives there too. I think the simple answer is no. I had no LGBT role models who were of colour, and I don't really recall any who were white either. When did I grow up? So I grew up in the sort of, my childhood would be 1980s, and then teenage years in the 90s. And if you ask me where my experiences of starting to understand sexuality, it would be actually from Channel 4, funnily enough, when my parents would go out to the Libs Club in Canton. I would switch on Channel 4 as quickly as I could, and there would be all sorts of things, you know, you'd have Jean-Paul Gaultier doing his thing, and that was like quite frivolous. But they also used to do a wonderful series of works from Derek Jarman. So some of his work would be there. And that, you know, that would give it a much more visceral and avowedly sexual experience through many texts, which I would enjoy, Shakespeare, etc., which I've been learning at school, and just wonderful content, which actually was rich in history, actually, in its own way. And there would actually be, you know, not wildly representative of people of color, but enough, you know, and more so that you might see in regular terrestrial channels. I mean, more so than you see on EastEnders at that time or something like that. So that's where I would find. I also had rumors about people who really said this publicly, but, you know, I had friends who knew relatives of Colin Jackson, and I always thought that Colin might be gay. I never knew, but the prospect of him potentially being gay gave me a lot of hope. And that sounds odd, doesn't it? And then there would be people who I thought might hang out in circles with gay people who I thought were fantastic and Black, such as Grace Jones or Naomi Campbell, who would be absolute fantastic role models for me, and still remain role models for me, because I think they are open, notorious, and fearless, and you sometimes have to be that. And, you know, you would capture role models through imagination, actually, of what you thought people were. How does that link to Stonewall? Well, I think Stonewall, in many ways, has said, well, let's be role model and let's just be accurate about who we are, what we do in what we do, and where we sit within the community and within life. And I think that behavior of being a role model and describing your journey is good, because it starts to become, in lots of different media, a new historical record, which people can look back. And you can also see through those ordinary, I'm just an ordinary person, so see through ordinary people's lives and their stories through blogs or vlogs or on television or documentaries, or even in the soaps and the media. You start to see a new historical journey in the present, which will be good for future generations, be good for the 5-year-old Sheldon who's growing up now in Ely or Butetown, to see and to observe. And I think on the historical art, I'm not a historian, but my mother is part of something called the Elders Group, which is a Black and minority ethnic group of people over 60 or 70. No, she's not over, they must be over 60. She's not, I mustn't put years on her. And what I love about that group, women and men, it's BAME elders, they go around and unearth areas where BAME people have never been present. So if it's in the military and people who died in the war, and I watch my mother's pictures, and you see her in spaces alongside military and all of these things, and plaques for BAME people who died in Second World War or First World War. And you say, and you just see, well, here is history, because here are these women and men going and saying, we stand here, we were here, and we remember our forefathers and foremothers, and we put our feet on this ground and we celebrate them. And that's active marginalized communities going back and reclaiming spaces, reclaiming histories, and saying, we exist and we existed, and here's the connection and the line. And we need to do that work. I'm very proud of my mother for being part of that, but we all need to do pieces of that work.
I absolutely agree with you, Sheldon. We heard earlier from both Nazmia and from Daryl that there is a difficulty in collecting the history. And I would like to go to you, Isaac. So collecting the history of marginalized LGBTQ groups can be part of cultural or religious taboos. Do you think that's true? And how do you get around that problem?
I always say lots of people. So I would, who are these people? LGBT plus history is, people always tell me what it means to be a gypsy, what I can and what I cannot, what I cannot do. I'm going to share a little bit of, and it's worth saying that the intersectionality of anti-gypsyism and discrimination experienced by LGBT plus Gypsy Woman Traveller community profoundly is double their experiences of marginalisation, exclusion to a degree that can only be understood by other Black, Asian and minority ethnic LGBT communities. I'd like to share a little project that we did recently. The Romani Cultural Arts Company launched our Gypsy Roma Traveller LGBT Spoken History Archive book. We also did a digital archive and also a book. And obviously we were actually proud. The actual book presented the texts from the Gypsy Roma Traveller LGBT Spoken History Archive. This publication follows the launch of an audio archive, which was compiled through research carried out by the Romani Cultural Arts Company with the support of the European Roma Institute for Art and Culture. The text version has been created with the support from the Welsh Government and is intended to further disseminate insight into the experiences of LGBT individuals from a variety of international Gypsy Roma traveller community. And that project was devised and run from Cardiff Gypsy Roma and Traveller LGBT. There was myself, who's a gay man, my colleague Christine Virginia Lee, who's a lesbian woman, originally from North Wales, and my colleague Dr. Daniel Baker. So that project was 100% led by LGBT Gypsy Roma Traveller community, which was just unheard of, and it's a global archive, which is, again, and it's cutting edge. No one else is doing this anywhere in the UK. This is a unique insight that brings to light the important and also fascinating moving stories told by members of a global Gypsy Roma Traveller community, highlighting the value roles that these individuals play in the rich diversity of the Gypsy Roma Traveller life. The results of the dynamic online resources that only documents and archives, but also celebrates the intersectionality of history, culture and experiences of LGBT plus Gypsy Roma travellers across the world. This timely project has given a long overdue voice to the often hidden Gypsy Roma traveller LGBT stories that our community members carry with them, and at the same time offer greater insight into the wider Gypsy Roma traveller experiences, insight which feels that gives a global perspective. So I would always challenge people when people are putting us in, and people will always make assumptions, but we have to stop them and we have to make sure they know that there are undertones of biased thinking. So if they're making an assumption about Black and brown people, including Gypsy Roma travellers, and people forget we are an ethnic group, you need to stop them in their tracks, and you need to remind them of their own biased thinking. I wouldn't, I own my gypsiness and I own my gayness, and I would never give that up to anybody.
I couldn't agree more, Isaac. Very, very well put. Daryl, sometimes I think we can all be guilty of this. Sometimes it's quite hard to distinguish whether something is queer because of the different generational habits. For example, cross-dressing, is it always trans? So what are your thoughts in this?
Yeah, I think different generational habits, but also different cultural habits as well. So this follows exactly on what Isaac and Sheldon and Naz have been saying about taking an assumption from a particular community and working with that, and then saying, well, this applies left, right, and centre to everything, and this is one way or the other. And this is the problem with taking material out of Victorian newspapers and earlier newspapers, in fact, and decontextualizing that completely, and saying that, for example, women wearing trousers, which was a slur actually in Victorian times, is an indication of something, when it's quite likely that the journalist who wrote that article wasn't thinking of the intent that we're now reading into it from a 21st century perspective. And so I would say also that this applies not just to generational thinking, but cultural thinking. So, for example, we know that the westernization and colonization of particular assumptions about homosexuality and queerness in general run in different times depending on different communities. So just because sexology in the late 19th century in Germany and Britain says one thing does not mean that that same thing is being applied or understood or accepted or culturally present in those very same communities that we're then looking into the records to pick out particular people because they then fit into a particular sense of what a gay man or a lesbian woman or whatever it might be happens to be doing in Dog Ellai or Blaen y Ffestiniog or something like that in that particular period, trying to think of communities that are overwhelmingly white, past and present there. And that's probably true also of large parts of the Rhondda and the Cynon Valley. So we won't just be assumptive there. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're trying to be cautious of. And so we need to be mindful of the fact that generations change. And we see that so quickly in our own times. So growing up in the 80s and 90s, or the 90s and the 2000s, as the others of us, we've seen how fast things have changed. And you imagine how fast things were changing a century ago. And to understand that process of change is to recognize that process of change in the past and deal with it properly.
Fantastic points, Daryl. Thank you so much. Naz, what would help you, because you did mention that there is a lack of understanding of how history is being archived, is being recorded, and by whom. What would help you to find Black lesbians and bisexual women in Cardiff's past? And what can we do? What could the community do to help you recover that history?
Sure. Well, I'm going to sidestep the question slightly because I don't think it's just my job to do that. But I mean, obviously, I'm interested. I'm also interested in finding out about the history of lesbians in Aberdare, for example. I'd like to know more about the fact that there was a tiny gay liberation front in Aberdare at one point. Love to know more about that. But I suppose the thing more broadly that would help is if people thought a little bit more about the processes of erasure that happen before a text is made or a historical record is made. And so it's not just about kind of unconscious bias training and like, have I thought to find have I rung up my friend to find out if their trans friend will be in my archive or whatever. I'm not talking just about that kind of tokenism and those kinds of problems, but also thinking about a record. And like when you find a record, there are all these processes that have gone into making it where other people have been erased. And one of the things that really clarified this for me was that I think I found this in Hey on Why. It's my last but one prop, right? And it's a Canadian book called Dyke Versions. So obviously I had to buy it because it was £2 whole and it's called Dyke Versions. Dyke Versions had a really checkered publication process. So actually the first thing after the introduction is notes on racism in the process. And what I find really fascinating about this book is that there are 5 editors, and 3 of them are women of colour, and there's a Black woman and an Asian woman, and the Black woman and the Asian woman write in their own, so there's an introduction from the collective. There's an introduction from the Black Caucus, which is these two beleaguered lesbians that I really feel for. I've been there. And they talk about the fact that they were added to the project late. The call outs had already happened. The call outs had gone to places where majority white lesbians would have seen them. The only Black and Asian women that had been contacted had been the high profile ones. So we're going right back to that Audre Lorde master's tools. It's not enough just to call me and see if I can come. It's not enough. And then there's like a third introduction featuring two of the white women who are like, yeah, we're really sorry. And then at the back of the book, the one white woman who refused to sign the sorry statement has written her own piece about how she felt about the editorial process. And I just think it's really fascinating, because oftentimes when we look at these situations, even this setup, like the person whose face isn't here is Lisa Power. Like Lisa's brought people together, or there are other kind of the movers and shakers and the people without which there wouldn't be a scene, but they know people for certain reasons. Like Lisa found me on Twitter, but she would also have noticed that we had loads of people in common, for example. So yeah, so it's just doing that really rigorous thinking about what is it that you're looking at. And also, and I promise to be quick, I'll just tell you about the cats. I think when you find something, and so I found this in a book in Castle Arcade in the mid-90s. I've been trying to think what book it was, and I've got a horrible feeling it was in a book that I didn't buy, and I took it out and put it into a book that I bought. So I was like, I need this. But it is a letter about a variety of people, including Tracy and Carol and Jill and Yvonne, who says that the person that this letter is being written to may be working on a sewage farm, and so on. Anyway, there's about 10 people mentioned in this, and some cats, Tea Time and Smith, who are fine. Pudding's had 3 kittens, very important. The entire time I've been holding on to this, I've assumed that every person in this letter is white. Why have I done that? I don't know if they're white. They could all be Black women. They could be, I mean, they're probably not Asian women, and like, but they could have shortened their names. And I think there's also, maybe we need to be a bit bolder and say, I don't need a picture of someone with an afro or a picture of a woman in a sari to know that this is my history to claim. That's, yeah. So think more broadly and keep stuff and share stuff. And if you know where things are, like if you know that something's in Glasgow, tell as many people as you can, because someone will want to see it.
That's amazing. I love the cats' names as well. I need to get a cat just to name.
Pudding and Tea Time.
Absolutely. Sheldon, what role do you think organizations like Stonewall can play to ensure that our history is not just written about white cis gay men?
I mean, I think it is a challenge which we have only taken on in the past few years. And I must be very open and honest about that. And it's a journey which Stonewall will continue on. And I think one of the ways in which you do that, we've just hired 5, or we've just taken on 5 new board members. So the board of Stonewall has about, I think, 14 people. We will have at least 40% of our board will be people of colour for the first time in Stonewall's history. I'm the first chair who is a person of colour for the first time in Stonewall's history. I think I was the second person of colour trustee within Stonewall, and I expect that the organisation should be rooted in diverse communities within its staff. But that's not enough. To actually practice in a genuinely inclusive and intersectional sense requires all of us, including me as a Black cisgender gay man from Cardiff, to cede some of our power, privilege, etc. to others. There's always someone more marginalised than anyone who ends up on a recording like this. than you, basically, always, because if you've got here, you have a whole host of privilege to actually manage to get here. And I always try to work on that basis. I fail every day because privilege is a very strong thing and very attractive and magnetic. And I think in terms of history, there are actually LGBTQ plus organizations which are based around historical record, based around archiving, etc. And I think one of the things that Stonewall can do is encourage those to ensure they keep a record. Our work is present and forward, and one of the things that we can do is ensure that we are recording and in a sense uplifting the experiences in the present of people in colour who are LGBTQ. And I think we are starting to do that. Our partnership with UK Black Pride helps with that. But we can go much deeper into communities and share some of the rich networks that we have and privilege that we have. I think the other thing to note about that intersectional experience, and it goes to one of the points that Daryl was making around contextualizing. We currently sit at a point in history in LGBTQ rights or activity, which is quite unique. And our approach to particularly transgender rights is having an impact on our own conception of ourselves as LGBT people. Who knows where we will be in 10 years? I can't predict history. I can't predict the future, but I can say that right now we are going through a change where some of us feel uncomfortable and want to retain very actively our approach to what I would call a sex-based experience of gender and our same-sex attraction. And some are moving towards a gender identity frame of reference. I think you can hold both. And I think the world is pluralistic enough to hold all of these conceptions. But what we know from history and what all of the work, the archival work that Daryl, Naz and others are doing, is that to hold all of those conceptions, you have to do that with respect, understanding, and an ability to accept that people might engage in certain activity which might be the same as you, but with a different openness of mind or a different conception of what they are. And that's history in the making. And I think although the current period is a bit painful in some senses, in one sense it's quite beautiful because it is an evolution of hard-won and hard-fought rights of people who I'm very proud of, even if they don't agree with the way in which I approach this now. I'm extremely proud and honoured to know of their work. And that is evolution. And I think, you know, the historians on this call, which I'm not one of, I hope you're keeping a record and archiving what's happening now, because I think it'd be really useful in the future.
Fantastic points. Thank you, Sheldon, so much. You will be happy to know we have reached our 10th question. It was our goal for this panel. So I would like to ask all of you, what is the one thing you want people who listen to this panel to do in order to retrieve the full history of our communities? Can I start with you, Isaac?
Yes, of course, Chair. I would suggest study history as a discipline, become a historian. The most interesting and valuable things about LGBT historians hold is their historical research and writing, not the LGBT. But can I add one more thing, Chair, if it's like possible? I know you said one. Can I add a second point? I also think it's very important that funders, people who are getting funding for LGBT work, there should be in their terms of reference, in order for them to get their grant, they should be putting a percentage down how much they're putting towards black and brown within the life cycle of their grant. So then let's say Stonewall says they're going to put 10% down for their black and brown work, then we have deliverables. We can then hold Stonewall accountable to say, right, you've got a 5-year funding stream. You said you're going to put 10% towards black and brown. Prove it, because then we will see more blackness, including Gypsy Roma travel work. Because since Black Lives Matter, people are coming out thinking this reimagining this like utopia, because quite frankly, society has failed black and brown communities, including my community, the Gypsy Roma traveller community. So I would say if we want to make a difference, make sure it's within the terms of reference these agencies are signing in order to get funding. Thank you, Chair.
I hope someone is taking notes, right, from the audience. Daryl, what would you say your answer is?
Ooh, my one thing, I think it's to recognize that we'll never write the full history of communities. That history in itself is an analysis of the past. And what that analysis is depends on what we want to find out about in the present and what our context is in the present and all of those other elements. So the one thing that I want people to do is to argue and to have debate and to have discussion and to have a rambunctious experience, because that is the way we discover multiple perspectives. That is the way we understand that just because you are from Aberdeen or from the Cynnar Valley, to pick a particular place at a particular point, or if you are from Butetown and Ely and other places of that sort, you don't have a history. People tell us so often that we do not have a history, but we do. And we have a queer history as well. And it's by having those debates and saying, hang on, I don't quite agree with that, that we then start to unpick all of the little threads. And so I want people to be rambunctious, if they are anything else.
Absolutely, and I'm pretty certain everyone on this panel is up for a very good debate. Naz, how about you?
I'd recommend that people be respectfully nosy, because if you don't ask about the things that you want to know, you will never find out. You know, so there are some really interesting stories that a few generations back in my family that nobody ever talks about, and then occasionally they pop out, and you've got to kind of maybe pick your moment and say, sorry, that thing that you said, Grandma, can you tell me more about this person who dressed like a man who used to live in your house? Like, what's going on here? So be respectfully nosy, otherwise you won't find out anything interesting. And also, I think that particularly speaking as a lesbian identified woman who very much loves and values her trans siblings and her trans sisters, like, you have to approach like lesbian history, which I think is probably one of the most contested things at the moment, with the most generous and like capacious understanding of the term. I think I might have borrowed that from Gail Lewis, this idea of like the capaciousness of a term. But, you know, lesbian is big enough to think about trans women who are lesbians. It's also big enough to include the histories of people who kind of came to the dyke scene because there was nowhere else for them to go, and now they live as trans men because that's their truth. That doesn't mean that they didn't at some point contribute to my history and my scene, and it would be pointless to make a story of my history without acknowledging those people. That's it.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Couldn't agree more. And Sheldon, what would be the one thing for you?
Yeah, so I've never really thought about this before, but this panel has inspired me to think about this, and I will actually do it, is that there are many organizations which actually are focused on race and also faith, which serve marginalized communities. And it follows on from Isaac's point in terms of, you know, organizations which get funding like Stonewall should have a commitment to put some of that to communities. I think those organizations were explicitly focused on race or faith should also have some form of discussion around, are they capturing the experiences, both historical and present, of LGBTQ plus communities? And I think that would both enrich in the most authentic way possible both those organizations and those communities, and serve us extremely well. Because sometimes history is best served from a variety of viewpoints, and sometimes from the viewpoint of the culture of the community concerned. And we know that sometimes the transposition of history can vary on the same subject matter, book by book by book, over century and century and century, author, depending on the culture. So those organizations which exist now do need to think about how they serve their LGBTQ populations within those communities authentically.
Wow, thank you, Sheldon. And you will be happy to know that we have reached the end of our questions. On a personal note, I want to thank you all very, very much for being here today. I come from a family that seek refuge in Greece, from Turkey, Albania, and Egypt. And I have been very interested in the family histories, the oral histories, but there has been this idea of we do not share trauma. We do not share what the family went through. And I know that over the past years, that family members that are older have been passing away. Those histories have been dying with them. I am aware that there have been members of the family that they have been cut off because of their gender identity and sexual orientation. And this is very, very sad to me as a bisexual woman. So I wish I had the opportunity. I wish I had the nosiness, as Nazmia said, to have inquired more about those family members and kind of try to retrace that history. I know it's difficult because all of the family were from different places in the world seeking refuge and avoiding those conversations, but I can't help but feel a little bit sad and a little bit jealous that this has been lost, and this I cannot trace back queerness, I cannot trace back gender expressions, that they were not westernized. Thank you all so much. I have been so inspired by all of you. Keep up the amazing work that you do. And I'm pretty certain that the audience will be reaching out to you, asking you for many questions and leads, and hopefully the people who look at the archives and who construct the archives do take something out of this panel. So thank you, Pride Cymru, for organizing this. And I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you.